I'm excited for this new series, and I want to frame it with some thinking from the book of Ecclesiastes. In the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon turns into this cynic philosopher. It's like he woke up on the wrong side of the bed, was feeling grumpy, put on all black, and sat in the corner and wrote this book of the Bible. It's got that sort of fatalistic type thinking all throughout. One of his favorite lines, which gets repeated a number of times in the book, is this: everything is meaningless, completely meaningless. It's as if he finds some sort of profound meaning from saying this over and over again. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me. But for 1 second, just for a brief moment, he takes off that black beret and kind of builds up a little bit of hope and has this reflection in chapter 3. He says, I have seen the burden God has placed on all of us. Yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He's placed eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. So I concluded there's nothing better than to be happy and enjoy ourselves as long as we can. And people should eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labor, for these are gifts from God. And I'm with the king on this one for sure, because time is a tyrant. And we don't always get to control or have a lot of say in when the seasons of our life change. What we have to figure out how to do is be content and faithful during those changing seasons. Because you and I were not built to spend our lives on a hamster wheel, not going anywhere, achieving anything, or feeling that we have any value or worth. We were designed for more than that. The text literally says God has seeded eternity in our hearts. There has to be more meaning to life than that. In fact, he continues that we are designed to enjoy and find happiness and joy in the changing seasons of our life and enjoy the fruit of those particular times. Not always look for the fruit of a past season or not always anticipating the fruit of the next, but figuring out a way to enjoy the fruits of our labors here because they are what? Gifts from God. So through this series, I'm going to be trying to give quick thoughts, little reflections on what it might look like to live faithful lives in different seasons of our adulthood. That's kind of how it's going to be framed today. And the scriptures have a ton to say about young adulthood specifically, which is where I want to spend most of my time today. So you don't have to be a young adult for this to apply. Tons of you are young in heart and young in spirit. Many of you are raising young adults. Some of you watching are soon to be young adults. I still believe there's a word from God for everybody for the message today. Solomon himself reflects fondly on the young days of his life, and he encourages all the young whippersnappers who read the book of Ecclesiastes or hear it read to reflect on what it means to focus on God during this specific season of your life. I want to give it to you from the horse's mouth. Here he is, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Solomon. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 says this: don't let the excitement of your youth cause you to forget your Creator. Honor Him in your youth before you grow old and say, life isn't pleasant anymore. Remember Him before the light of the sun and moon and stars is dim to your old eyes and rain clouds constantly darken the sky. Remember Him before your legs start to tremble and before your shoulders stoop. Remember Him before your teeth stop grinding and before your eyes see dimly. He continues and lists a whole caseload of annoying things that happen as we get older in life, but I think you get the picture just from this snippet of the text. A big question that pops out to me from Solomon's reflection thus far is, if we are supposed to remember our Creator in the young days of our life, and it's so important, how do we actually do that? Like, is there a means and a way to reflect on Him and not miss the moment? It's critical for us to try to understand that. So I want to ask, how do we best remain faithful to God as young adults and impute whatever season of life you're in? I imagine it still has some relevance. Personally, I think one of the most critical things about remaining faithful to God as young adults is to have something called grit. And grit is not a huge cultural value for us anymore. In fact, it's sad to say, I think grit is glaringly vacant from the lives of a lot of young people today. And we need to figure out a way to spice that back up. I think part of the reason that we've raised a generation or so of people without a ton of intestinal fortitude and grit and perseverance is because as a culture, we appreciate talent more than we appreciate faithfulness. That it's like we prefer to label people stars and praise them for their aptitudes and their potential rather than their sustained effort and follow through. And that is where grit really should focus our attention. I think in focusing on talent rather than effort, we may have raised a generation of strong starters, but not necessarily nurtured them to be strong finishers. Okay, does that make sense? So Angela Duckworth is a researcher out of the University of Pennsylvania, and she is the world's foremost expert on grit. She's written tons of journal articles, done presentations, and has an entire book on this. She's an expert. And she doesn't just know about it from a theoretical perspective. She owns this at a personal level, because when she was growing up, her father told her regularly that she was no kind of genius. So what does she go out and do? Well, even maybe missing the talent and aptitude for her dad to see, or even feeling that herself, she put her nose to the grindstone and she worked hard. What did she do? She got into a couple of Ivy League schools. She scored a research position at a prominent university, and she has spent decades researching the world's grittiest people and environments that produce or at least expose grit. And irony of all ironies here for her dad and for herself is recently she actually won the MacArthur Genius Award. Someone who was told she was going to be no kind of genius because she didn't have that talent or potential on the surface ends up being labeled a genius by the top scholars in her field because of her unique contribution. I find that pretty amazing and inspiring. She's the type of person I want to learn from about how to have a gritty lifestyle. Her main thesis is this: sustained effort is more important than talent working towards achieving our long-term goals. In fact, in her grit formula, which I'll get to here in a few minutes, effort counts twice. I'll show you what that looks like. One of the initial places where she studied grit at a deep level was at the United States Military Academy in West Point, which is a really hard place to get into. In fact, for graduating seniors, you're just as likely to get into an Ivy League institution as you are to get into West Point. You have to start applying for West Point your junior year, so there's multiple years worth of hurdles to get through. About 14,000 people will start the application. About 4,000 of those on average will secure the necessary recommendation from a congressman, senator, or the vice president. You can't just get any recommendation. From those 4,000, about 2,500 will have the academic and physical, I guess, attributes to be admitted into West Point. But of those 2,500, a selection committee winnows that down to about 12 to 1,400 people who will ultimately get admitted and enrolled. Many of them are varsity captains of sports teams and kind of use that as a strong metric. Now, despite having all of these hoops to jump through, years worth of application, getting a senator or a congressman or the vice president to write you a recommendation, you'd think there's already grit built in. But amazingly, 1 in 5 cadets who go through all this stuff and get in end up dropping out before they graduate. And most of them drop out in the first 2 weeks, known as beast barricades. Now, if you know a little bit about military stuff, you know that in the past few years, beast barricades has changed a little bit. And I think Angela would even say changed for the better. But when she was studying it about a decade ago, this is what she found. And when she was studying it, this is how it was described by West Point itself. Beast barricades were the most physically and emotionally demanding part of your 4 years at West Point, designed to help you make the transition from new cadet to soldier. And Angela was brought in as a researcher to help fix the system. Because despite having this advanced algorithm where they assign numerical scores to all these different values of applicants, West Point was horrendous at being able to guess who was going to drop out during the process and who was going to persevere. In fact, in all of their years trying, they almost never guessed right. So Angela was brought in to try to figure out what is going on. And after a couple of years of study, she made this unique discovery. West Point was phenomenal at measuring the potential for new cadets, but was not great at measuring their grit. They assessed every part of these cadets or these applicants' lives. They looked at their GPA, they looked at their extracurriculars, they looked at work that they had, they looked at their references, and they even had a couple of years worth of data on how they put effort and work ethic into different things. But according to Angela's calculus here, West Point was amazing at measuring skill, which in her formula is talent plus effort. They were great at measuring skill, talent plus effort, but they weren't great at measuring grit, which in her calculus is skill plus effort to get you to the achievement that you want. See, effort counts twice in the first part of the formula and the second part. Premium cadets drop like flies during beast barricades or barracks and other times. And these are big, smart, strong people who've made it through so much already. Why are they dropping out when they've scored so high on their potential? Well, she goes on to explain this a lot. You can read it in her works, and you can even read some of the journal articles that have been published on this specific study. But as I was hearing her talk about it, I thought, man, that reminds me of something in the Old Testament. It reminds me of this moment where Samuel is standing before the sons of Jesse, and the Lord says this: "Don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at things like people look at them. People look at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart." See, Samuel is standing before these sons, playing an awkward game of duck, duck, goose, because the goose is nowhere to be found. He's out in the fields tending the sheep. And Samuel's in front of these kids, trying to make an educated guess and judgment about the next king of Israel from social conventions of his day. How did they measure talent and aptitude and skill? Well, strength, physical appearance had a big say in this entire formula. Those conventions, though, looking for somebody who's going to be big and have the shoulders to carry the weight of the responsibility, has already failed Samuel in one big test case. You remember who it was? Saul himself. Saul was this massive man for his age, and everybody looked to him as the strength of the nation because of his physical stature. In the day, big stature meant big character. That's how they measured aptitude and skill and talent. But do you remember when Samuel announces him as the king before everybody? What happens? There's an empty stage and the sound of crickets. So the people in chapter 10, verse 22 say, "Where is he?" And the Lord has to speak into this moment. He says he's hiding among the baggage. So they found him and brought him out. By the way, that should have been a red flag that he wasn't in the light when it mattered. But when they brought him out, he stood head and shoulders above everybody else, and his stature overwhelmed the moment. So Samuel said to all the people, "This is the man the Lord has chosen as your king. No one in Israel is like him." And there's this big hurrah shout, "Long live the king." Unfortunately, ancient talent scouts missed the mark with Saul. And again, hiding in the moment probably should have been a red flag, but I don't want to be too unfair to Saul, because he actually does jump out of the gates with some initial effort and some initial success. Right after he's crowned king, he wins a couple of critical victories that really win him the support of the nation. Unfortunately, through his success, by his own measure, he manages to stop keeping his heart fixed on God, which is the real goal of the process, and starts worrying about himself. And he becomes really bad at receiving criticism and feedback. He did really well, quite honestly, in those first few chapters, as far as his talent would take him. But when the challenge changed, and he needed more than just talent to get through, when he needed grit and sustained effort and focus, singular focus on God and what God wanted, he came up short time and time again. His reign, by the way, is proof that your talent is nothing more than your unmet potential if you don't put in the effort and you don't have grit. This is a lesson that I think all young adults, soon-to-be young adults, and those who are raising young adults really need to learn. In their quest for sustained faithfulness through the seasons, we need grit, because in real life, at work, in your marriage as a parent, there will be times where your initial skill level, despite what everybody says about you and all the praise they have for you or all the confidence you have, there will be times when your confidence runs up against an immovable force and your talent, your base skill level will not get you through. So what do? You need grit and determination in this world. You cannot just be a good starter or great starter. You can rely on talent to start things. We have to look at what finishing looks like, because that's faithfulness to God. For you today, that might mean swallowing your pride in your 4th year of marriage and seeking some counseling if things are getting a little bit rough. Don't let pride get in the way of the goal. Have some grit. Maybe you have an annoying boss and you've been slaving on their behalf. You've been putting in the work for years. And after 7 years of sustained effort, right when you think you're going to get your break and promotion is up, it passes on to somebody else. What do you do in that moment? Talent can't get you through that. You need some grit. What happens when the loan forgiveness program you're a part of and have really been banking your whole family's financial status on unravels and doesn't pay out when you need it to? What happens when the kids you're raising don't turn out to be the little angels that your family and your friends expect them to be? There will be times when your talent will not get you through. I know this to be the case as somebody who's still in this season myself. As a young adult, there is spiritual stuff going on with all the swirling concerns that you manage in startup jobs and in education and managing your finances and starting a family and working in your marriage. There is spiritual warfare at work. And there will be temptations galore to try to pull you back into your sinful behaviors of the past. What do you do when your spiritual life runs dry in this season? You will need some grit. So what do you do when your talent can't get you through? Saul is somebody who had culturally recognized talent and who put in some initial effort into the equation. But he lacked the grit and the determination and the sustained effort to pursue the Lord and achieve what he had set out for him. Now flip forward a few chapters, and we encounter Samuel again standing in line in front of the sons of Jesse. And he's looking for David, who's not there, because David is out in the fields, putting in the effort to hone some of the tools of his craft. And David doesn't look like much compared to Saul, but he's one gritty dude. And I think it shows something for us. It's a principle for our lives. You don't necessarily get to choose to be talented, but you can choose to be gritty, right? You don't choose the family you're born into, how tall you're going to be, whether or not you have amazing ear for music, but you can choose to grind regardless of the initial cards you're dealt. One chapter later from this, Israel is threatened by a giant, and David is sent on a little errand. He's the errand boy to bring his brothers a care package who are out at war. And when he shows up, he sees the whole nation trembling in their boots at this mammoth of a man who's out calling them out. Goliath is standing in the way of God's mission for Israel. And so David, somewhat a shepherd boy, small in stature by comparison, steps up and says in chapter 17, "Don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him." And he's got Saul's ear, and Saul says, "Don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy." And he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persists. Listen to what he says. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats." Doesn't sound like a great resume off the bat, does it? But listen to him develop it. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If an animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this for both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too. For he has defiled the armies of the living God." And the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. So finally, Saul consents and says, all right, go ahead. May the Lord be with you. I think he's just got his fingers crossed. This isn't going to go well. David was bear tested and lion approved. See, he didn't just waste his time as a shepherd boy in that entry-level position that nobody wanted to have, just feeling sorry for himself. He didn't think this entry-level position was beneath him and his potential. Listen closely, young people. This entry-level position, because he is an entry-level candidate, was not beneath him or his potential. Long, dirt-crusted days afforded him the chance to master the tools of his trade. And that included, by the way, a slingshot. Here's what I know. Gritty people manage to see potential in their current situations, while non-gritty people just get frustrated and complain that nobody is seeing their potential. Do you see the difference? No one will give me a shot. No one will help me change the world right now. How am I supposed to change the world for God if nobody's going to give me a shot at anything more than welding trucks? Well, you're learning in this process that in the real world, the path to success and achievement is through hard work and sustained effort. It's through showing honor and respect before receiving honor and respect. Success comes through long days and nights of sustained effort and stress and sweat. But faithful people who tend sheep, those who are faithful in the unseen, those who see potential in their situation and grab it by the horns, those who continue to grind even when they're tired or stressed or bored or they've got a conflict-ridden relationship at work or it's just not feeling glorious anymore, those who keep grinding are ready to slay giants when they come. People who faithfully tend sheep are faithful when giants show up. Grit matters in this world. Saul was chock full of potential and talent, but he's upstaged in this critical moment by a small shepherd delivery boy, but someone who has a grit-honed tool. After this moment, David ends up getting promoted and being part of Saul's court, but he doesn't surrender his drive and his grit because he knows that God has created him for more than this. He knows he's destined to be king, but the path to the plan that God has for him is paved with faithfulness to God and showing honor the whole way. Listen closely, young people, including myself, who just want things to be available to us immediately. Even though David is anointed king in chapter 16, and even though he slays a giant in chapter 17, it's 15 more chapters before he gets the throne. And in those 15 chapters, a lot of bad stuff happens to David. He doesn't just immediately get thrust into the moment. He has to grind. He has to prove his honor and loyalty to other people. Stuff gets squirrely in his life to try to reach his potential. But he's faithful to God. And as he's faithful to God, he ends up embracing and exceeding his potential. Here's what I know. Life is unfair. Sometimes people just straight up suck. Opportunities that you thought were going to happen will melt through your fingers. But don't give up at the first sign of struggle. Don't give up and quit your job with the first confrontation you have with a colleague or the first time you feel slighted and disrespected by a boss or a ministry leader. Don't tuck tail and run when marriage feels like work. Okay? All of these things are bound to happen in your life. It is a promise. Don't cave to the desires of the world when your spiritual life feels dry. There is more for you, but it may take more effort. Like it or not, speaking to people round about my age, the perception of young adults is that they are soft, they're entitled, they're lazy, they quit too soon. If we want to be perceived as more than that, we're going to have to learn how to be more than that. Stereotypes don't develop without some level of truth to them. And here's the truth today. We can be more than that with God's help because God has a plan for us to be gritty people to reach our potential in Him. He has set eternity in our hearts. And he looks past all the man-made metrics and expectations about your potential and your talents and your skill level. He looked into the heart, and he wants to plant a grittiness that comes through his Holy Spirit to help us be, to cultivate it, and turn us and transform us into gritty people like Jesus Christ. God gives us, God empowers us, and God has a plan for us. So you don't get to choose which generation you're born into, but you can choose to be gritty, and we need to make more gritty choices as young adults. Here's a caveat though, another angle of this, and it's super, super important. Otherwise we might miss the whole point of the message. One of the things that Angela talks about with grit is that it's not really about sticking to short-term goals, like getting up this morning and going to the gym, or trying to save for the vacation. It's not just the effort we put into short-term goals. For her, grit is about long-term determination. Here's how she defines it. She says, grit is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Gritty people aren't simply passionate about their short-term efforts, what they're going to do next week or next month or this year. They're not concerned about a specific weight loss goal for the year, or a sales quota, or a relational goal that we have. All those are important, but grit is bigger than that. People who are gritty have a pursuit and a passion that transcends those short-term goals and helps frame them in general. People who are gritty have a mind captivated by a vision for the future that's bigger than where they currently are. And it's a vision that's worth putting in countless hours of effort and sweat and stress to make it become a reality. Deliberate practice, goal after goal, hurdle after hurdle. For some people, it's the patriotic duty to serve, right? To climb the ranks in the military, not for themselves, but for duty to country. For some people, it's carrying on a family legacy in maybe a specific field, taking over a family business, or pursuing higher education just because that is what your family is, and you're singularly focused on those goals. Maybe for you, you want to be the best person in your field. Like you've got the drive and determination like Michael Jordan in The Last Dance. Like, I'm going to be the greatest who ever played the game. And I'm going to drag people along if I have to. That's what sustained him and motivated him for years and years, and won him 6 championships. Maybe you have this grand vision for a tight-knit family with generations who live around you and know each other's names and know each other's passions and can support each other. And that, a tight-knit family, drives how you make your financial decisions and whether or not you move away from home and what sort of educational goals you pursue. Gritty people have a grander vision for their life that holds their attention. It's like blinders on a horse. Short-term goals matter, but not near as much as the long-term goal. Through everything, we cannot, as young adults, miss the main thing. You can apply grit to all these areas of your life, and I'm convinced it's a key to success in so many avenues of our life. But as young adults, we have to keep the first thing first. You can't just apply grit to your work and climb the ladder. You can't just apply grit to your family. You must apply it to your pursuit of God at all costs. Because God, and pursuing Him and being transformed into His image, that's the reason we're here to begin with. If we're missing the main thing, we are missing out. That is what Solomon's entire point is for the book of Ecclesiastes. When he says everything in life is meaningless, he's being exaggerated, right? The reality is your goals, your pursuits, your feelings, your family, your work, all those things matter. What Solomon is saying is they're nothing compared to the main thing. Focus with singular focus and grit on your pursuit for God, and all of those other things will fall into place. Dia Irby defines grit like this. I like it. It's not clinical, but it's really experiential. She says, doing what you don't want to do to be who you want to be. Does that sound like any of your job situations or marital relationships or extended family stuff, right? Doing what you don't want to do in a moment or for a sustained period of time to be who you want to be. So who do you want to be? Do you want to be somebody known as someone who's climbed the corporate ladder, CEO, or I want to be known by how many digits are in my bank account, or I want to be known by how many people call me grandma and love me? Like, all those things are kind of cool, and they can be short-term things, but it's The main thing, who do you want to be? I want to be somebody who's known for singular pursuit for God and his calling on my life. Saul got this backwards. All the potential in the world, but he missed the one thing. See, one day the Lord asks Saul to wipe out the Amalekite nation. And he means everything, not just the soldiers, but just get rid of absolutely everything. And Saul partially follows through. Here's how it goes in chapter 15. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle and the fat calves and the lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless, you could say, in parentheses, for them, or was poor in quality. And Samuel has a rough, restless night because God is speaking to him about what Saul has just done. So he gets up and goes and talks to him. Now, from Saul's perspective, you can imagine how hard of a command this would be to carry out. All right, boys, we're picking up arms. We're brothers. We're going to fight. We're going to destroy this nation. But you get no share of the bounty. We're not keeping anything, even if it's great. We just have to completely slaughter all the animals, destroy all the buildings, wipe everybody out. Doesn't matter. You can't have any. That's maybe an easy thing to think about philosophically, but to carry out that battle order, that's a tough one. And so Saul cedes the power here to his people. He feels the pressure. Saul is singularly focused on the people's approval, not on God's approval. When it came, down to the line, he knew where he was going to lean. So listen to Saul's defense when Samuel comes and addresses him about what God has spoke to him that night. It says in chapter 15, early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. Been there. May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's command. But Samuel asks, then what is all the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear? If you did what you were supposed to do, what's up with all of this livestock around? And Saul says, it's true that the army spared the best of the sheep and the goats and the cattle, but they're going to sacrifice them to the Lord. We destroyed everything else. Now, have you ever pulled that with God? I think I even have, right? You try to trade things with God. It's true. I've sacrificed my spiritual pursuit for him for the first few years and got my law degree. I don't know what it is for you, but what trade have you made where God told you what you were supposed to do, what faithfulness looked like, and you decided to rewrite the script, right? Look at how much more money I can offer now because I didn't focus on God for these 3 years and I focused on this internship. Look at how much more effort I can put into church ministry because I didn't focus on my family when they were young. God is not interested in those sorts of trade-offs. For him, faithfulness, obedience is way more important than the sacrifices we bring. And that's Samuel's retort to him. Saul says, I did what God told me to do. But I didn't follow through all the way. But it was really all for him. My deviation for God's plan for my life was all about God. And Samuel was like, yeah, sure it was. This is an example of misplaced grit. Singular focus and resolve towards the wrong end. And after this incident, Saul practices misplaced grit. Rather than using grit as a tool to seek the Lord, he seeks to keep what he has by using God as a tool. That's never going to work out in any of our lives. As a young adult, promise, you will be tempted by everything under the sun. This season of life is hard. Every season is hard, but when you're trying to figure it all out for yourself and you've got pride in the equation and you're trying to start a family and you don't want to make the same mistakes as your family before you, and you're trying to be financially independent and you're trying to be spiritual leaders, all of these things will feel really heavy. And it will be very easy to divert your attention to focus your grit on different things in your life and cut out your spiritual life and your focus on God and being a spiritual leader for your family. And what we try to do as young adults, I see it time and time again, I've got the temptation in my life, is to say, God, I'm going to focus on this for a few years. And when I'm done focusing on this, I'll give you all I have. I just need life to calm down. I've got too many things pulling me in different directions. God, give me a break. Here's a hard dose of truth for you. Life is never going to calm down. The seasons just change. And when we try to make that switch and say, God, I'll give you myself later, we always end up giving him less of ourselves, and we miss the moments that he's designed for us. We miss our potential by having grit in the wrong direction. This is Solomon's plea to all of us. Don't sacrifice the most important thing, knowing God and being transformed into the image of his Son, to pursue all the other things our culture and our families, even our churches, will ask us to pursue. The author of Hebrews says this really, really well, and I hope it hits home, especially for young adults today. In chapter 12, he says, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance. You could insert grit, the race marked out for us, not the one we're trying to mark out for ourselves. Fixing our eyes singularly on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Do you see the grit of Christ in this passage? His singular focus on the long-term goal, the plan and the path that God, his Father, laid out for him, the passion and perseverance, the grit necessary to achieve it. Because he didn't just endure the cross. That's the end, and it's so important, but think about all of the early rising prayer sessions throughout his life. Think about the long, grueling days of ministry and just being zapped of energy from everybody else. Think about the concerted effort and deliberate study with the 12 disciples that he is developing. He had the ability to forsake all of the temptations for power and status in this world and focus on who God says he was and who he wanted him to be and where he wanted him to go. He was gritty. And remember, grit isn't born. It's made. And you can change today and be more gritty with God's help.